Vladimir Komarov. On April 23, 1967, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov climbed into the Soyuz 1 spacecraft, preparing for what was supposed to be a triumphant milestone in space exploration. This mission was meant to prove that the Soviet Union was still ahead in the space race. Komarov wasn't just any pilot. He was a decorated hero, close friends with Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. But even before liftoff, things were already going wrong. Engineers had discovered hundreds of technical problems with Soyuz 1. Reports say over 200 design flaws were documented. It wasn't ready to fly, but canceling the mission wasn't an option. The launch had been planned to celebrate Lenin's birthday, and political pressure was enormous. Everyone in the program knew the risks, even Komarov himself. Before the launch, Gagarin allegedly begged the higher-ups to cancel the mission. When that failed, he reportedly showed up at the launch site, hoping to take Komarov's place, thinking maybe officials wouldn't risk letting a national hero die. But it didn't matter. The order was final. Soyuz 1 would launch no matter what. As the rocket roared off the pad, Komarov's fate was sealed. Within minutes of entering orbit, the first major failure struck. One of the solar panels refused to open. That meant half of the spacecraft's power was gone. Without electricity, several onboard systems started to fail. The spacecraft began to spin uncontrollably, and the automatic orientation system malfunctioned. Mission control on Earth could barely hear Komarov over the radio static. He tried to stabilize the ship manually, sweating inside his bulky suit as the cabin temperature climbed. His oxygen supply was unstable, his navigation instruments flickered in and out, and the power continued to drain. Every time he tried to fix one problem, another appeared. Still, Komarov stayed calm. Engineers on the ground scrambled to find a way to bring him home safely. They decided to attempt an emergency re-entry after only 19 orbits, something that had never been done before with this type of capsule. As Soyuz 1 descended through the atmosphere, it looked like the worst was over. Komarov's capsule began to glow as it re-entered Earth's atmosphere, and radar showed it falling right on target. The ground crew waited for the signal that his parachutes had deployed. Seconds passed, then minutes. That signal never came. When rescue teams reached the landing site near Orsk, what they found was devastating. The main parachute had failed to open, and the reserve chute had become tangled. The capsule slammed into the ground at nearly 150 miles per hour, exploding on impact. Vladimir Komarov became the first person in history to die during a space mission. Despite the tragedy, Komarov's bravery changed the Soviet space program forever. His death forced engineers to redesign the Soyuz capsule, the same type that decades later would become one of the safest and most reliable spacecraft ever built. Apollo 1. On January 27, 1967, three of America's top astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, climbed into their spacecraft for what was supposed to be a simple pre-flight test. It wasn't a launch day, just a routine plugs-out test on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy. Apollo 1 was meant to be the first step toward landing a man on the moon. Inside the capsule, the three men were testing systems under simulated flight conditions. The spacecraft wasn't fueled, it wasn't moving. It was just a test. But even before it began, problems were piling up. Communication systems kept cutting out. Ground crews struggled to hear the astronauts clearly. The cabin atmosphere was filled entirely with pure oxygen, a common setup for testing, but one that turned the spacecraft into a potential fire trap. The astronauts were growing frustrated. Grissom, a veteran of two earlier spaceflights, had been warning engineers about safety issues for months. He famously hung a lemon over the simulator, calling the spacecraft a lemon, a term for something faulty and unreliable. But NASA was under intense pressure to meet President Kennedy's moon deadline. The schedule couldn't be delayed. By late afternoon, the crew was sealed inside the command module. Engineers outside were still fixing minor electrical issues when suddenly Grissom's voice came through the headset. "Hey, we've got a fire in the cockpit." At first, no one believed what they were hearing. In the pure oxygen environment, a tiny spark from a wire had instantly turned into an inferno. The cabin pressure skyrocketed, and within seconds, flames engulfed the entire interior. The astronauts were trapped. The hatch, designed to open inward, was held shut by the increasing pressure inside. Ground crews rushed to help, but the flames were too intense. The test area filled with thick, toxic smoke. Technicians tried desperately to open the hatch, burning their hands on the metal as they fought to reach the crew. But by the time they managed to pry it open, it was too late. The fire had lasted just 17 seconds. When rescuers finally saw inside the cabin, all three astronauts were gone. Grissom, White, and Chaffee, America's finest, lost not in space but on the ground. The investigation that followed was brutal. NASA found that almost everything about the design had contributed to the disaster. From the flammable materials inside, to the wiring, to the high-pressure oxygen environment. The tragedy shook the entire space program, but it also forced NASA to rebuild Apollo from the ground up. 18 months later, Apollo 7 launched successfully, flying with the lessons learned from Apollo 1. And just 2 years after that, humans walked on the moon. Soyuz 11. On June 6, 1971, three Soviet cosmonauts, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Viktor Petsayev, and Vladislav Volkov, prepared to make history. Soyuz 11 would be the first crew ever to board a space station, Salyut 1, the world's very first permanent home in space. The mission began smoothly. The rocket lifted off flawlessly from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, carrying the three men toward a new era of human spaceflight. The crew docked with Salyut 1 2 days later, and for the first time, humans were living and working in orbit for weeks at a time. Inside the station, they performed experiments, took photographs of Earth, and spoke to their families from hundreds of kilometers above the planet. Everything seemed like a success. The Soviets had done it again. But what the world didn't see was that life aboard Salyut 1 was far from perfect. The air inside the station was filled with a strange burning smell. The temperature was too high, reaching nearly 30 degrees Celsius. Their food was bad, their sleep was irregular, and the systems constantly malfunctioned. After 23 days in orbit, they were finally told it was time to come home. They sealed up the space station, loaded their gear, and climbed back into their Soyuz capsule for re-entry. At this point, no one suspected that anything was wrong. The spacecraft separated from the station perfectly, and the crew began their descent toward Earth. As the capsule re-entered the atmosphere, everything looked normal. Communication with ground control was clear, and the landing zone was confirmed. The parachutes deployed as expected, and the capsule touched down gently in a remote area of Kazakhstan. Rescue crews rushed to the landing site, eager to welcome the heroes home. The capsule looked intact, with no signs of damage. But when the recovery team opened the hatch, something was terribly wrong. All three men were dead. At first, no one could believe it. Their bodies were still strapped in their seats, motionless. There were no burns, no impact injuries, just silence. The world's first crew to live in a space station had returned to Earth lifeless. The investigation that followed revealed a shocking truth. During re-entry, a tiny ventilation valve had accidentally opened when the capsule's modules separated in space. In less than 30 seconds, all the air inside was sucked out into the vacuum. The crew had no spacesuits. They never stood a chance. They died silently just minutes before landing. Soyuz 11 remains the only human spaceflight in history where an entire crew died in space. From that day on, every cosmonaut would wear a pressure suit during launch and landing. Space Shuttle Columbia. On January 16, 2003, 7 astronauts boarded the Space Shuttle Columbia for mission STS-107. A scientific flight that would spend 2 weeks in orbit conducting experiments. It was Columbia's 28th mission. The crew included Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, and mission specialists Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon, Israel's first astronaut. After months of training, they were finally going to space. As the shuttle roared off the launch pad, everything seemed perfect. But just 82 seconds after liftoff, something went wrong. A brief flash appeared on the left side of the shuttle. A piece of foam insulation from the external fuel tank had broken off and struck the orbiter's left wing. On the ground, NASA engineers noticed it, but they'd seen foam strikes before. They assumed it was harmless. The mission continued. For the next 16 days, Columbia orbited Earth around 255 times. The astronauts ran hundreds of experiments, studying combustion, gravity, and life sciences. They even broadcasted videos back to Earth, smiling, floating, and joking. From their perspective, it was a complete success. But beneath the surface, disaster was quietly waiting. The piece of foam that had struck the wing during launch had punched a hole in the shuttle's reinforced carbon panels, a gap just large enough for something deadly to happen later. On February 1, 2003, the crew prepared to return home. They strapped in and began re-entry at over 17,000 miles per hour. The descent started smoothly. Data readings were normal. But as Columbia entered the upper atmosphere, superheated air, reaching temperatures of nearly 1,600 degrees Celsius, began seeping through the damaged section of the wing. Sensors started to fail one by one. Ground control noticed strange readings from the left side, tire pressure dropping, temperature spikes, then complete loss of signal from several instruments. Mission control called out, "Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages." There was no response. Seconds later, people across Texas looked up to see streaks of fire tearing across the morning sky. Columbia had broken apart at nearly 200,000 feet above the Earth. It was over in seconds. When search teams arrived, debris was scattered across hundreds of kilometers. There were no survivors. All 7 crew members had died, just 16 minutes before their scheduled landing in Florida. The investigation revealed that the foam impact during launch had caused the fatal breach. It was a simple piece of insulation, something that weighed less than a few pounds, but at launch speeds, it hit with the force of a cannonball. The tragedy grounded the shuttle program for more than 2 years and forced NASA to completely rethink safety procedures. The lessons learned from Columbia led to stricter inspections, in-orbit imaging, and the eventual end of the shuttle era. Challenger disaster. On January 28, 1986, 7 astronauts climbed aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger for what was supposed to be one of NASA's proudest moments. It was mission STS-51L, and among the crew was Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from New Hampshire who had been chosen to become the first civilian in space. Millions of students across America were waiting to watch their teacher make history. The morning was bitterly cold at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Ice-coated parts of the launch pad. Temperatures had dropped below freezing overnight. Engineers from the company that built the shuttle's rocket boosters, Morton Thiokol, were worried. They warned NASA that the rubber O-rings sealing the rocket joints might not work properly in the cold. If those seals failed, hot gas could leak out during launch. But NASA was under pressure. The shuttle program had already faced multiple delays, and the world was watching. After heated debate, the launch was cleared to go ahead. At 11:38 a.m., the engines ignited and Challenger lifted off. The sky was clear and blue. Everything seemed perfect. The astronauts smiled, radioing calmly to mission control. Reporters called it one of the most beautiful launches ever seen. But just 58 seconds after liftoff, flight controllers noticed something unusual. A faint flicker of flame near the base of the right booster. It was the O-ring. The cold had caused it to stiffen, and it hadn't sealed properly. Superheated gases from the rocket engine were now burning through the side of the booster, directly toward the external fuel tank. At 73 seconds, the shuttle was 14 kilometers above the Atlantic when disaster struck. Without warning, a massive explosion tore through the sky. On live television, millions watched in silence as Challenger disintegrated, a white fireball splitting into 2 smoke trails. Mission control lost all contact. The pieces of the shuttle rained down into the ocean. There were no survivors. Commander Francis Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe had perished just over a minute after takeoff. Schools, news stations, and millions of children who had been watching live couldn't believe what they'd seen. The investigation that followed revealed the full truth. NASA's culture of pressure and schedule obsession had led to the fatal decision to launch despite warnings. The O-ring failure was known and ignored. The tragedy changed NASA forever. The shuttle program was grounded for almost 3 years while major design changes and safety reforms were made. If you liked this video, subscribe for more, and drop your suggestions in the comments below.